Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Fort Ord Reuse Authority special meeting for Monday, October 29th, 2018. To start off, let's have the Pledge of Allegiance if Supervisor Phillips would lead us.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, are there any acknowledgments, announcements, or correspondence?
Just an acknowledgement of the America's Competitive Exchange, that the event that occurred last week. We had several members of the board who participated. We had active engagement from everybody from Supervisor Phillips' office to the City of Sand City to the City of Monterey's mayor came and welcomed everybody. Mary Adams was one of the speakers. We had a number of folks at that event. Since that time, we've had almost 100, I don't see Josh here, almost 100 follow-on communications that have occurred with the City of Monterey, City of Delray Oaks, or other jurisdictions in the region. The Central Coast Marketing Team is the primary sponsor, but Fort Ord Reuse Authority, City of Marina, especially the folks from the airport were actively engaged. It was quite an event and wound up producing a lot of economic activity that we hope will generate jobs and other kinds of things in the future. But it was a very positive event, and I just wanted to mention that.
Okay, very good. I've been advised that there is no closed session.
That's correct.
Great. Okay, so move on to roll call, please.
Supervisor Parker? Here. Supervisor Phillips? Here. Supervisor Adams? Here. Mayor Edelin? Here. Councilmember O'Connell?
Here.
Councilmember Morton? Here. Councilmember Hoffa?
Here.
Mayor Rubio?
Here.
Councilmember Campbell? Here. Mayor Carbone? Here. Mayor Gunter? Councilmember Garfield? Here. Councilmember Reimers? Kathleen Lee? Senator Monning? Here. Erica Parker? Here. Mike Zeller? Dr. Diffenbach? Here. Steve Matarazzo? Here. Dr. Ochoa? Colonel Ford? Here. Bill Collins? Dr. Triblee? Here. Lisa Reinheimer? And Dr. Moore. You have a quorum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll get right into the official business of today's agenda, starting with the transition planning process update. And I'd like to begin this with ceding the floor to our esteemed Senator Bill Monning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I appreciate the opportunity to join you today and to weigh in and maybe provide some updates on the transition process from my point of view and from a Sacramento perspective, as well as a regional perspective. I want to start on a somber note of acknowledging the loss of life this past weekend at the Temple in Pittsburgh. It's a horrific tragedy. Unfortunately, not the only tragedy we've suffered in recent months in this nation. What distinguishes it in part is the motivation, the articulated motivation of the alleged perpetrator, and how that's affected, I think, a level of discourse not only in our nation but in our communities. And so as we honor and respect those families who lost loved ones, I would hope that could guide our commitment to civility, to respectful engagement, and to moving forward with a task at hand as leaders in our community. As leaders, the people that elect the elected members here elect us with the expectation that we won't avoid conflict, but that we will engage in a principled and respectful manner and be solution-oriented. And I think the ongoing work of FORA and the challenges that we currently face require that type of recommitment, that type of leadership, respectful engagement, and solution-oriented work. I've followed the work of the board and the work of FORA staff moving forward with the required transition planning from the last extension. I've also more recently met with LAFCO and had the opportunity to meet with LAFCO representatives this morning with FORA representatives, and I'll comment a little bit on that process. I've also met with various jurisdictions and constituents concerned with our future planning. And as you all know, there's a spectrum. There are those who say, let FORA sunset. There are those who say or have voted extend FORA. And those come from positions of self-interest, of perception and experience, and ambition looking forward. Not personal ambition, but jurisdictional interest and ambition. I would submit that now is not the time to be spending energies on extend or sunset, extend or sunset. What you are required to do by law is develop a transition plan. And LAFCO is required by law to provide oversight to the implementation of that transition plan. Now, I know you have on today's agenda a proposed transition plan. I know there's various concerns about everything from timing to content, and that will be the subject of deliberations today. I also know that there's part of the follow-through from the last meeting, a commitment to start a process of retaining a facilitator or facilitators who might help in that process, which I wholeheartedly endorse because we are in a process. Today we're not voting for extension or sunset. This is not a state matter. This is not for the state legislature to decide. FORA is a local regional body. It has a governance system represented here today by elected leaders and appointed leaders whose task it is to figure out how we move forward with the bigger vision of implementing a regional vision, a regional plan. And I think if we all wrote on a piece of paper our vision for this region and for the future use of the former Fort Ord, there'd be a lot of commonality in visions of housing, of recreational space, of veterans housing, maybe homeless, addressing homeless, removing blight, guaranteeing sufficient water. I think we would all aspire and have a vision, but we get caught in the process and we lose the ability to embrace that original vision of making this a regional resource, of involving regions and elected bodies that don't touch the former Fort Ord, but who are part of a region to be served by the uses and future uses in the land that is Fort Ord. So as I come to this as the senator who carried the first extension of FORA with a sunset that was negotiated with Assembly and Senate committees, and which contemplated a sunset by 2020 with a transition plan proffered by the end of this year, 2018, and with 2019 to move forward with that transition plan. Now, LAFCO assumes a certain responsibility under the existing legislation. I've been frustrated with LAFCO now saying it needs to meet with its board before its role can be affirmed or decided. That will happen, but whatever this body comes up with, I think LAFCO needs to be intimately and integrally involved, working with FORA staff and the FORA board. If LAFCO has problems with what it thinks it can assume or should assume, they need to frame it. Anyone at this table who has concerns or problems, instead of saying extend or sunset, frame the problem, and with it, proffer a solution. In negotiation, we talk about the use of single text documents. You can negotiate and talk, but it's when you put something in writing, you give people something to react to. And you can react with a thumbs down or a thumbs up, or you can proffer a counter proposal, another idea, a better idea, a way of splitting one issue into two. So I'll wrap up. I'll be here through today's meeting and listen to your deliberations. I know the issues are complex and multiple. I applaud the work of the FORA staff in trying to move forward in framing, in the charts, in the imperfection of any of us knowing exactly how to move the regional vision forward. I want to thank those and from the jurisdictions who have stepped up with proposals. I think people who have shared ideas, I would invite you to synthesize those into written proposals that could be shared with all the jurisdictions. If your jurisdiction thinks here's a path forward, put it in writing, get specific, and tell us how do we deal with ongoing implementation of a base reuse plan or current obligations or the benefits of CFD, funding that allows us to achieve certain objectives. So that's my hope. My staff in Sacramento and here in the district, you all see Nicole regularly representing me here at the local meetings. Bethany and Toby and my staff in Sacramento are committed to this. We've engaged the staff of the Governance and Finance Committee in the State Senate, people with years of expertise on local land use planning, etc. But the state and the legislature is not going to make the decisions for you. We're going to respect the work of the FORA board and LAFCO, who this morning I expressed my anticipation and expectation that they will work closely with the FORA staff and the FORA board, not to say no, but to say how or why not, and then how do we move it forward. So the timetable is clicking. The timer is clicking. And we have a certain statutory obligation by the end of this year. Will it be fully realized? I don't know. But between now and the end of the year, we need to take these charts and shrink them into categories of doable, done, challenges, problems. Let's do that exercise so we can break this into the pieces under the various categories, whether it's water or transportation or unexploded ordnance or building removal or CFD. These lend themselves to solutions. And again, I applaud those. I'm not saying there's been no solution-oriented thinking here, but it needs to be shared. Good ideas need to be shared, and concern with other proposals need to be recognized with written submissions, and not just critique, but solutions. Now's the time for leaders to step up and be leaders. I commit fully to work with all of you. My door is open. My office is available. And if you've got a better idea than the one that's being floated in front of you, share it with FORA, share it with me, share it with other stakeholders. But I'll just close on the note that I opened with. We are living in tough times. The threats that I referred to, the violence, is not limited to the East Coast. We are not immune from these threats in my offices and the offices of others here. We need to lead by example and elevate a level of civil discourse and solution-oriented work. And if we do, I think we will come up with a plan that is best both for our jurisdictions and for the people of Monterey County, which is our ultimate charge. So, Mr. Chair, thank you. I will be here to engage in conversation as appropriate, but I here really to listen as you go through today's agenda. So again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Senator, for setting the tone. At this point, I'll turn it over to the Executive Officer, Mr. Ullmark.
Thank you. Members of the board, I just would like to make a few brief comments before Sheri Damon takes you through a few slides. A lot less than in the past, but there have been quite a few changes from the last couple of versions that you have seen. We have a couple of comments I want to begin with, starting with, we don't know if we got all of the letters because they've been coming in rather quickly this morning. We did get one from our colleagues at Marina Coast Water District, and thank you for providing some copies. We made some extras to make sure that everyone got a copy, outlining some solutions and some additional information that we can incorporate into the resolution, and we appreciate that. We also received a letter from City of Marina concerned about the meeting time and the delay and the scheduling, and we want to make sure all the board members know we apologize for how difficult it is to get all of this put together. The board just mentioned to us a brief couple of weeks ago that it would like to have this meeting and to do a doodle poll. Not everybody was available or answered us right away, but this was the day we could get a quorum. We in no way delayed our transmittal. We, in fact, had some really good meetings in between the last board meeting and this one, with representatives from all of the jurisdictions, through including a discussion about the transition plan with the administrative committee, through a meeting that we followed the board's direction by having members of the individual jurisdictions' legal staffs to all meet and talk about some of the issues that had surfaced in the last 60 to 90 days, along with responding to letters we had received from our colleagues at Landwatch, who had great concerns about whether what we were doing complied with CEQA. In fact, we got another letter last night from Landwatch, I think around 8 p.m., looking at and questioning the actions that are being done as to their applicability for state law and how we would proceed with that. We also received some questions from the representatives of Keep Fort Ord Wild, and we're attempting to get them the information that they asked for as well. Several members of the board asked questions pertaining to the items that are coming up today as to how does this work, how does that happen, how can we make those. So we attempted to address those, and this presentation today and the adjustments that you saw in the resolution are an attempt to try to bring all of those pieces into form. I'm not sure we perfectly responded to that, but hopefully the board can give us more direction. By the way, we also had two members of Authority Council staff who were actively engaged in looking at each of these pieces to make sure that, to the extent the form was right and the substance followed the kind of conversations the attorneys were having, that we could put something together for everybody to consume. So we want to thank everybody for doing all that. Profusely apologize if any, because we did the best we could to get it scheduled at a time where everybody can make it, and if it came in a little later than you would have wished, we're sorry for that, but this is the best putting all the pieces together we could do. I also wanted to mention that we have 64 days and 8 hours before we can comply with state law. Senator Monning is very eloquent in expressing the concerns that we've heard from the folks in his office and the conversations we've had with the staff and the Government and Finance Committee and other entities in Sacramento about making all of this work and getting legal review with respect to Community Facilities District, to the tax implications, all of the things that are a component of this resolution. So we at staff recognize that all of you put a lot of time in. We appreciate the kind of individual comments we got from folks like Steve Matarazzo about planning implications, about the work that we get from Congressman Panetta and his help. So we appreciate all that, and if I could ask Sheri to take you through these slides. There will be not 60, not 50, not 40. I think we might have 30 slides or so. These are all focused on bringing you up to date with things that have adjusted recently. And some of these slides we will go through rather quickly, and as a consequence, We wanted to make sure you all had a copy at your desk in case there's reference you want to make to something that's on one of the slides as Sheri goes through these quickly. Sheri?
Hello, can you hear me now? Hey, my name is Sheri Damon, and I will be doing your presentation today. Thank you, Mr. Hulamard and all. And you have seen some of these slides, so transition plan, you've definitely seen this slide. You definitely have seen this slide, which is just a historical picture of Fort Ord and where we've been and where we've gone and going to. Overview of what I'm going to talk about. The background, I'll breeze through that pretty quickly. What's new? We do need to make the record. We're going to take you through the revised transition plan resolution and outline some of those key issues that are still out there. So this is where we were in terms of 2017. This board said create a single entity to finish the FORA program. Seek extension of the CFD and powers for a successor, and in the absence of that, utilize the implementation agreement, percentages, assignments for jurisdictions' fair and equitable share to complete the FORA program. That's not what this transition plan does per se. It breaks it down, but this is the guidance. One program, one plan, finish the program. That's where we were in 2017. So we've gone through meetings pretty much every month since January, either at this board or before the transition task force or transition ad hoc committee, going through and compiling all those documents, all those contracts. We've met with LAFCO. We've met with attorneys. We've had all of that. We've provided additional information and presentations to this board, clear up until today's meeting. So what's new? We had some recent meetings between Monterey County staff and attorney staff. We presented to the admin committee, and we also have met with some of the jurisdiction's attorneys to go over issues and legal issues, in particular with the draft transition plan resolution. So what are we asking today? Today we are asking that you consider approving the draft resolution without prejudice to make later revisions, and that you find the approval is not a project and is exempt from CEQA as a mere organizational change. There are a series of additional actions that we have included in our agenda, and I'm summarizing these. They are not verbatim, but essentially they are transmit the plan, if it gets approved, to LAFCO by December of 2018, so comply with the statutory mandate. Authorize the executive officer to execute the LAFCO indemnification agreement. Retain a facilitator to assist in the transition plan implementing agreements, and provide a progress report to this board in January of 2019 where we are, and then quarterly progress reports with information updates as they come on board. So again, a process, an iterative transition planning process. It's not unfettered, let's go out and negotiate. It's let's go negotiate and let's bring it back to the FORA board so the FORA board can check in on a quarterly basis. So let's go through that resolution. Your new resolution, and it's not really new, but I would say it's clarified and it's reformatted. It has the facts and circumstances. That's what we called the background previously. Section 1 is now the preliminary findings and determinations. And those preliminary findings and determinations touch on a lot of subject matters. Section 2 is the assignment of assets, liabilities, and obligations. Section 3 is now an insurance provision. And Section 4 is the implementing agreements and the implementation agreements. The implementation agreements, let's just be clear, those are the agreements that the underlying land holding jurisdictions have with FORA. And the transition plan implementing agreements are new agreements to implement the transition plan. So, Section 1, these are all the subject matters that are addressed in the findings and determination, the base-wide costs and base-wide mitigation measures, what this board believes those are and the definition of those, CEQA, revenue sharing, the reuse plan and master resolution. Basically, these are how this board would like this plan to work, the overarching framework. Section 2, 3 and 4. So Section 2 is now the assets and a disposition thereof. They're called out fairly specifically. Everything from the Section 115 trust funds to retirement reserve, litigation reserve, habitat funds, other funds, the ESCA reimbursement contract, personal property, those kinds of things. There are some new provisions in here, and I've highlighted those. The administrative liabilities, in particular, the CalPERS liabilities are fully paid. So the idea here is we had some comments about constitutional issues and impacts on jurisdictions, member jurisdictions, general funds. This is an attempt to address that by directing all of FORA's assets, either cash and or property tax revenues, to make sure that the administrative liabilities are fully paid. There's a new provision that addresses, to a certain extent, the stick approach, and it's not a big stick, but it's the transition plan implementing agreement as a condition precedent to receipt of FORA funds. So the concept here is, let's get on entering into these agreements so that we can get the funds to you. And finally, real property transfers, because all the property will not be transferred prior to June 30th, 2020. There's at least one piece of property, the landfill parcel is the main piece that we're aware of that may not transfer prior to then. In fact, it's not scheduled to transfer until sometime after 2022. Section 2.2 are the liabilities and obligations and assignment thereof. Section 3 we talked about briefly as a new provision relative to insurance, and that is, we call it TAIL, or cover yourself insurance. And then there is the transition plan implementation insurance, trying to ensure, if we can, the transition plan to address the litigation issues that may come about as a result of implementing this transition plan. We've got a new section, a new glossary section that adds some definitions. We also have a new Exhibit B, which are the reference documents link. So trying to compile more evidentiary support for the information in your resolution. So we've tried to compile all that together. So pretty much we just talked about that slide. Transition plan implementing agreements. We went over this 2 meetings ago, but the idea is that the transition plan implementing agreements would have a background and definition. It would be how jurisdiction would implement the transition plan, how revenue would be generated, revenue shared, how the capital improvement projects are going to be implemented. It may be as simple as saying the projects within our jurisdiction are in TAMSI's Regional Development Impact Fee Program, and that's how we're going to raise the revenue, to it's in our capital improvement program, and we will be collecting revenues on a permit-by-permit basis and handling it in the same way that we handle our other capital improvement programs. And then how the jurisdiction intends to comply with the enforcement policies of corridor developments. So mainly prevailing wage, but also affordable housing. There are some other policies that are inherent in the forward program, like a 20% affordability requirement that is above even what redevelopment law was. So redevelopment law mandated 15%. The FORA program has a 20% target for affordable housing and also has prevailing wage provisions. So that's what we would anticipate, but this is not set in stone. This is just an example. The agreements might be with FORA and be assigned to another entity to enforce, like LAFCO, or they might be regional agreements or a series of agreements between, let's say, the County of Monterey and Marina as to a revenue sharing agreement, and that's how those two jurisdictions intend to address and implement regionally projects that are under their control. Okay, everybody ready for a laugh? These are the attorneys, the avatar. This is the new version, the avatar of the attorneys. All right. It's not meant to offend anybody. It was really meant as a kind of a joke. The attorneys got together, and now we have some key legal issues. And some of these issues cannot be written out of the transition plan. The transition plan, as it's currently drafted, does have an approach to each one of these issues. And so I'm going to try to take you through them as best that I can. The first one is one we've heard a little bit about, the LAFCO FORA jurisdiction and powers. Then there's an issue that I like to call survival, and that's survival of the base reuse plan, the master resolution, the capital improvement program, and whether those projects that are inside of FORA's capital improvement program survive post-2020. I do think there's still some discussion about what exactly needs to be completed after June 30th, 2020. And then finally, survival of the implementation agreements. Do those survive FORA or do they not? And CEQA is an issue almost in everything that we do. So just going to the government code on what is it we have to do, highlighted here about what FORA has to do and when it has to do it, and what LAFCO is supposed to do. FORA is to do a plan that assigns the assets, liabilities, responsible successor agencies, and provides a schedule. It's set out to be approved by only a majority vote, and it's due to LAFCO by December of 2018, or 18 months before FORA dissolution. LAFCO, on the other hand, has some statutory obligations under the FORA Act, which is to provide for the orderly dissolution of the authority, including all the contracts, agreements, and pledges are properly honored and administered, and all assets are appropriately transferred. So I think the Senator referred to it as oversight. The FORA board regionally adopts a regional transition plan, and LAFCO is responsible to ensure that it's implemented, is how we, FORA, and Authority Council have interpreted this language. So your transition plan approach reflects that. It asserts the FORA board exercises the assignment power through the FORA Act legislation, and it calls for implementation of the plan through transition plan implementing agreements. But it's structured that if there are no implementing agreements, then makes assignments and requests that LAFCO ensures those assignments as though they were conditions of dissolution of a special district. We are hopeful that this will be addressed through regional transition plan implementing agreements, but understand that we don't have an unfettered amount of time to get into those agreements, which is one of the reasons why you've seen in my previous presentations and at various points a March 2019 date. We have to get into those agreements. If we're going to agree and implement by agreements, then we need to get to those agreements, so that if there are no agreements, we know what has to happen next. Survival of documents, base reuse plan, master resolution, capital improvement program, and the implementation agreements. So these are handled differently for each one. The base reuse plan, the transition plan approach acknowledges that those base reuse plan policies are almost non-issues to the extent that an underlying jurisdiction's general plan has been found consistent with the FORA program. The FORA policies and programs have already been incorporated into the general plans. That's not true, though, with respect to the master resolution. And so the transition plan does still recommend recording the master resolution for notice of what those provisions are as of June 30th, 2020. It continues, the transition plan resolution continues to utilize the implementation agreements unless there is a transition plan implementing agreement that shifts those. So where there's regional agreement that modifies the implementation agreements, those would be modified. You would have a subsequent writing in the transition plan implementing agreement. And finally, it requests that all of FORA's projects be included in somebody's capital improvement program. And for the most part, I should note that almost all of FORA's projects in its capital improvement program are currently in somebody else's capital improvement program. That is true with respect to everything but 6 projects, and those are the ones where FORA is the lead agency, and those are not currently in somebody's capital improvement program. So we would hope that in terms of moving forward in the transition plan implementing process, that those projects would be addressed. CEQA. Here's your transition plan approach. It clarifies that right now, what we do today and in this resolution, we are simply approving a overarching plan for reorganization. We still have a whole bunch of steps to go in this program, the transition plan implementing agreements. There are still several places where this transition plan might change, but right now it's a plan for reorganization. It relies on the jurisdictional commitments in the implementation agreements for funding base-wide mitigations and costs. It relies upon the projects that are in other jurisdictions, the underlying jurisdictions, capital improvement programs, and I would note that includes Marina Coast Water District, among others, who has water augmentation, among other things, in their improvement program. It calls for jurisdictions who take action not to implement projects to perform required environmental review. So many of the jurisdictions have, let's say Davis Road was not going to be done. At that point, when the county decides to revise its capital improvement program to remove that road from its capital improvement program, it would be doing the required environmental review at that point in time. So that's what this transition plan calls for now. And it provides opportunities for regional implementing agreements and amendment of the transition plan, which we talked about. Resolution of key issues. This is how your plan overarchingly tries to address all of those legal issues. First of all, it says, let's see if we can't get to regional agreements, to see if we can't concur on how we can move forward. I do think that it's an overarching issue in the regional agreements about finishing the program, and that is the purpose of the findings at the beginning of the FORA transition plan resolution, is it tries to define what the program is we're trying to finish, and if there is no agreement to finish that program, then bring the agreements forward for the parts that you are intending to finish. Second part, or the second prong of action, would be litigation, and that could be a declaratory relief action. It could be breach of contract, it could be public trust, it could be CEQA. I don't know what the cause of action is exactly. I know declaratory relief is one of them when you have two different opinions, an actual case in controversy on, let's say, the interpretation of the FORA Act. Most likely that would be a declaratory relief action where you ask the court. FORA Authority Council has the belief that this is what the language means, and some other jurisdiction attorney has the belief or the opinion that it means something else. Court, please decide this for us. And then the third prong is legislation. And that legislation, we do have, and we have gone through draft legislation, but this is not exclusive. These are just some issues that we've had on potential legislative amendments, and I actually heard some additional ones fairly recently. But the end date, how do you address the end date, and for what purpose? Is it to implement the transition plan, a regional transition plan? Is it just to change the date? One of the issues that we've heard that legislation might address is board membership. Who should be involved in making future decisions vis-a-vis if you extend the organization in some way, shape, or form? how you conduct business. Is it a 2-vote, unanimous first vote, 2-vote rule, or is it just a majority vote? And finally, policy enforcement, nature and extent of what actions and when FORA can take action to make policy enforcement decisions or actions. So on prevailing wage, affordable housing, jobs, housing balances, etc. Currently, your policy enforcement happens at consistency determination, and unfortunately, we've seen multiple repeat issues in some of these policies coming up that were not able to be fully addressed at the consistency level. There were some other suggestions about possible legislative amendments, not extending the FORA Act at all, but having some kind of a standalone that addresses transition plan issues. Nothing is worked out, nothing is set in stone, but some opportunity to address things like how you extend the community facilities district in the absence of extending the FORA legislation, if that's a possibility, how you deal with potential CEQA issues, how you might deal with base reuse plan, or what parts of the program you finish. One thing I've observed, we started the FORA Act and the FORA program as a regional program, and the way that I've been looking at it is we're trying to finish the regional program. So you had a regional base reuse plan, and now we have a regional transition plan, and that's what we're trying to implement. If you have written comments, it would be great to provide those comments to planning@fora.org. I would note to date I don't have any comments to planning@fora.org. I have lots of comments to the board at fora.org or other places, but not to actually the transition plan email that we have set up for actual transition plan resolution questions and comments. Timeline, board approves the transition plan resolution October through March 2019. We're hopeful to get a good amount of the implementing agreements facilitated, hopefully. December 2018, we would be submitting the transition plan and any implementing agreement to LAFCO, and I don't know that we actually will be successful in having any implementing agreements prior to December 2018, but there might be some low-hanging fruit that the parties can agree to and bring in a very simple transition plan implementing agreement, and maybe not the exclusive agreement, but part of the agreements. And finally, March 2019, we would be bringing back quarterly reports with additional information, unresolved issues, and allowing this board to take action. One of those implementing issues is FORA staff needs to, and this board needs to adopt a resolution of intent to terminate its CalPERS contract so that we can get CalPERS to give FORA its actuarial analysis. That process is a minimum 1-year process, so we will be bringing something to this board in December of this year, depending on what happens with the transition plan. But we want to get that going as soon as possible so that we can refine the information that we need to bring back to this board with respect to the administrative liability, the CalPERS liability, know what we're dealing with, etc. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Damon. I'm going to go ahead and start public comment now. Let the public speak on this, and then we'll get to our questions and discussion. Public comment on this item is now open. All right. Seeing no one coming to the mic, we'll go ahead and start with questions for staff. Ms. Garfield.
Where to start? I appreciate all the work that's been done in the background. We've had conversations with our city attorney. Our city's attorneys have been talking to each other. So, you know, AT&T is happy. They're getting a lot more use on their cellular networks. I do have a quick question on the best way to share our thoughts on constructive suggestions that's within the scope of the Brown Act, so that I'm not sending something out to everybody and they're sending something back to me. May not, but before the end of today, can we have a way of handling and sharing ideas that's within bounds? I'd appreciate that. I'm going to take a stab at a couple of underlying things that I'm just not able to tell anybody else why. The one of them is how will we settle the issue of whether this transition plan triggers a reevaluation of CEQA? That's been brought up over and over again. We're kind of down to the and I really want us to have a way that we will solve this authoritatively so we are all able to understand that. And secondarily, if somebody could explain to me what the without prejudice that later we can make changes, what is it we're voting on or being asked to vote on? Is this a plan that we're willing to commit to? Because if it is, I think I've been advised that I need to bring anything that commits Pacific Grove's resources to Pacific Grove's Council for their review and in specific direction. That means to me that we all have to be taking the same thing back to our councils, so we have to have agreement about it before we do that. So that's a loop that I don't know that we've got in our plan, but I think we need to have in the planning process. And then the assignability issue. I realize that if we have implementing agreements in place that take care of everything, then the assignability issue is moot. And that would be wonderful. But I would like for somebody to give me an explanation, to give us an explanation of how that assignability has been determined. And I know there's been assertions made or research done, but I don't think that has been laid out as well as I need it for it to be, to understand how that would be work going forward. So I have, but one big thank you. Thank you for clarifying the CalPERS thing, that we're all done at the end of a period that we can, and from what I understand, Helen's saying before is that whether FORA continues or not, we can put a stop for our CalPERS obligations at a specific date and be settled up. And I think that was a very good way to go about it. So thank you for that. And then lastly, in the previous rendition of this, there was an mention that for litigation that was not settled by the end of 2020, that there would be recourse to go back to the underlying members for additional settlements. That is not in this agreement, thank you. But I'm wondering what the solution is for litigation that has been, is it in play and not solved, and an unknown outcome. So that's an unknown that I'd like for us to have in here somehow. So that's enough, don't you think? Yeah. Thank you.
Mr. Hoffa and then Ms. Morton.
So I have a few thoughts. One comes out of a conversation I had with our city attorney, who suggested that it might be advisable for us to respond to the letters we've received today before we take action. So that's just one thing I think would be helpful if we have a written response to some of the concerns that were raised by Landwatch and KFOW. We know in the past we've been sued by them. I think it's a legitimate concern we could be sued here, and by having a written response that could be submitted to the court in the event that there is litigation, I think that's something we want to consider. I also am personally not comfortable with us avoiding CEQA and doing an EIR. I understand the sort of rationale this is just a reorganization, this isn't really a project. But again, it seems to me highly likely from a practical standpoint that we will be sued if we don't do one. And I think from a risk mitigation standpoint, it makes sense to go ahead and do one. Even if we can't finish it in time to meet our deadline, I think that would be a sign of good faith that we are involving the public and doing due diligence. So that's one of my concerns, and I don't know how that affects things if because we're doing an EIR we don't meet our deadline. But I think doing an EIR here has legal, financial, and probably public input benefits. On page 16 of the handout, one of the key legal issues is the base reuse plan, master resolution, CIP implementation agreements. And I think in the transition plan, it basically requires the jurisdictions to include all of the elements of the CIP on their own CIP. My problem here is we know there's not enough money to complete the base reuse plan. We know even if we have the $72 million that we are likely not to have because of the CFD not being enforceable for entitled projects once FORA is gone. That's $72 million, but we know there's even more than that. So if we know that we can't fully implement the base reuse plan, how can we assign these liabilities to the jurisdiction to complete the base reuse plan? It seems like a catch-22. So it seems to me that at some point we need to have a hard conversation about what are we actually legally required to complete in the base reuse plan CIP, and then, and then what else can we do if there's monies left over, and those should be assigned. But it seems to me not reasonable to assign a liability to somebody when you know that they don't have the financial wherewithal to complete it. And then finally, this is really a question for Senator Monning, and it has to do with a legislative fix that might be short of seeking extension. And I'm wondering if it would be easier and more politically possible to get an extension of the CFD power, the existing CFD power that would then maybe be assigned to the jurisdictions so that the $72 million in question would at least be, retained in the region. So those are my thoughts and a question for Senator Monning.
Okay, Ms. Morton.
Through the chair, do you want me to respond to that, or do you want to wait?
There may be other questions for you.
Okay, thanks.
So to address that portion of the 72 million, the 55 million that is within the jurisdiction of Marina, we are continually moving forward on securing contractual obligations to recapture what will be equivalent to the CFD when FORA sunsets on June 30th, 2020. But our contractual terms actually are greater than that because we understand the cost to build the roads that we're going to be required to build, to give the 30% to the habitat management far exceeds that 55 million of what we need to generate, plus we have blight removal. So going to the issue of extending the CFD to Senator Monning, the City of Marina has opposed that because it's very cost prohibitive to us fulfilling the responsibility in fulfilling what we need to do as our portion of the CEQA mitigations, as what we're required to do by contract, and what we voluntarily are looking forward to doing in the City of Marina for fulfillment of the regional reuse plan. And 6.7 Government Code 67679 per ND, if that's extended, it precludes the jurisdictions from implementing a fee structure that may actually work, as opposed to continuing the fee structure that's currently in place with a deficit of at least 67 million. And even if we go forward and somewhere there's 67 million, the cost to the jurisdictions will be more than what is in the FORA CFD. For example, the City of Marina, we will be reimbursed $9.5 million. The cost of putting in our roads will be 2-3 times. I don't have an exact figure, but I know it will not be sufficient. So that is why the City of Marina objects to any extension of the CFD, because those 12 financing mechanisms are precluded from us unless FORA agrees. And the complication is it's difficult if the City of Marina says, we're going to tack on an additional $20,000 per residential unit, and the developer is saying, well, if I just do it someplace else, if it's the FORA CFD still sticks, we're concerned that FORA isn't going to approve that our city can tack on more. I want to ask some questions, and I think the comments by both Ms. Garfield and Alan Hoffa were excellent questions. City of Marina objects to this plan being voted and accepted today. With less than 24 hours, we have not had an opportunity to review it as a city. Our legal staff got it after 3 o'clock on Friday, and it's less than business hours, not weekend hours, that we have not had an opportunity to get any feedback from our legal staff and think that action today would be inappropriate. As to the slides, going to your slide 19, one of the things that I understood from 2016 Transition Task Force was the base reuse plan has been recorded against all title, and that was a covenant running with the land. And I'm looking at the master resolution policies that you've identified on your slide 19. And my question is, what is in the master resolution policies? That's the 6,160 home limitation.
It's not in there.
It's not in there?
It's not in there.
It's the prevailing wage provision. I'm trying to make sure, what are the policies in that, the full scope that we know we need to address as jurisdictions?
So
what are you trying to protect? I thought the house limitation was in there, so go ahead.
I don't know if, Chair, do you want me to answer directly, or because there are a whole bunch of questions here? I was just trying to compile it.
Oh, she can answer them all at once. Okay. The other question that I had in your draft resolution at section 2.1.6 about funds, and it says that funds are going to be returned pursuant to their voting percentages as set forth. Wouldn't we look to see what were the source of the funds to determine how they would be refunded to jurisdictions? For example, if you're a jurisdiction that pays $14,000 in dues and that's the only contribution you make, why would you get a refund of tax increment monies or CFD monies? Shouldn't that be among the land use jurisdictions? I think there's a problem with that. So I'm asking that question. As to the HCP, in here we have an HCP created as an entity, and I know we're addressing this separately. City of Marina's concern in a HCP is that we have $20 million by time FORA sunsets, that the cost model is $1.3 million every year to fund what needs to be done, and that's money's not going to generate that kind of income. Should we, in this transition plan, be looking at greater funding putting into the HCP to make sure that that is accomplished, and secondarily to look at the cost model to ascertain if it's better for a memorandum of agreement with oversight as opposed to an entity that has CalPERS issues and other things. The other question that I had is the recommendation in this transition task force as to ESCA is to continue with the full-time employees that are working on ESCA. It doesn't identify what that cost is. So in a plan that is saying I'm going to close CalPERS, I'm going to satisfy my CalPERS obligations, but we're going to retain employees for ESCA, are we not continuing to increase our CalPERS unfunded liabilities? And there's no funding source with which, in this plan that I see, with which to fund that additional money. So how do we address that? Thank you.
Yep, Sheri, outstanding work on this, along with the rest of the FORA staff. I mean, this is watching the various iterations gone through. This is a great product that we have right now. That being said, this is also probably the most important document we've had in the FORA for the last 20 years. All of us received this on Friday. Most of us had to work over the weekend to look at it, but the bottom line is the city councils, the board of supervisors, and our residents have not had a chance to weigh in on this. I like this document myself, but I really need to bring it back to my city council. So my question is, when would be the most reasonable time we could schedule a special board meeting where we could actually come back and vote on this thing? Because voting on it right now would not do our residents or our underlying legislative bodies any justice.
I agree that the secret issue is a concern. Frankly, it's not to me, but with the threat of lawsuits, I'm just wondering whether a declaratory relief action or something like that to get that out from under us is something that's advisable. I agree with what Ms. Garfield and some of the others have said, that I don't think I can step up and recommend something until my county has really had a chance to really work on it. And I know they've been wanting to meet with staff and have more discussions than we've had, but I feel hamstrung about doing that until my county takes a position. And I do support the idea of a facilitator coming in to work on this. We probably maybe should have done that even sooner. So.
Let's see. Someone over here was next. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I have a couple of questions. One does have to do with sort of the role of county staff in some of this. I imagine that it sounds like county staff did meet with FORA staff, and says in the board report that some of the concerns have been responded to. But my question is, did the staff see the changes before they were published in the document that we see here today? I just have a couple questions about that, because there are some obligations or some responsibilities that are suggested to be assigned to the county that raised my eyebrows. And if the staff said that was a good idea, I'm willing to look at it, but it was a little surprising to me. And there was something that was being referred to the Superior Court for some sort of responsibility on their part, and I don't know if they were asked either. But it just, as I say, there are just a couple things that I'm not sure that the staff I'm accustomed to hearing from would have agreed to some of the things I see in here. Then I have another question that sort of gets to the document. We've suggested a couple of times, and I hope that there's been discussion with LAFCO about whether a highly simplified transition plan would be acceptable, really laying out, FORA has identified what the issues are, and then, saying that agreements on ESCA, discussions are happening between the county and Seaside, and then a timeline for when that's going to happen. I think some really simple, bare bones transition plan like that might be advisable and hopefully acceptable to LAFCO when we have a document that continues to have issues like the key legal issues that haven't been resolved, and FORA is trying to resolve them in the transition plan. You don't have a transition plan that I think that the jurisdictions can agree to. We need to have something where the issues can be worked out in an appropriate setting. But, with FORA staff is smart. They've been working hard. They've been working for a long time on this, and to continually come up with a document that has the same issues that have been identified as disagreements I just don't think that's going to be a transition plan that LAFCO can work with, or that the rest of us can get past our jurisdictions for approval. So the question in there is, have we looked at a more bare bones version, and have we talked to LAFCO about whether they would accept something along those lines? And I just have concerns about being as prescriptive as we are in some places here in this transition plan before the negotiations have happened between the jurisdictions about agreements. We may be able to come up with those kinds of agreements. Then there are just some kind of more specific things. Under the administrative liability, I had two questions. One is, it looks like the PERS liability, the backup plan for PERS liability would be the use of property tax. The county is one of the larger recipients of property tax. I don't see how that doesn't impact our general fund. So that's not a solution that I think the county would be comfortable with. The other administrative liability has to do with lawsuits. Other people have raised this. What if there is a judgment that is brought against FORA? It's still in litigation when FORA sunsets. Where's that money going to come from? I think the only figure I saw in here was $300,000, and recent history would indicate that may not be sufficient. So then there's another, it's kind of a detail thing here, but it's a policy question that was raised in this document. I don't know how we adopt this without resolving the issue, so I'm just going to bring it up, and that is that if there's any leftover money that might have been set aside for PERS, for instance, should it be divided among the voting members or put in CIP projects? And I think what makes sense to me, and it seems kind of obvious, that the money should go into CIP projects, ones that are underway, like South Boundary Road or Davis Road or some of the others. I just don't see how it would be appropriate for a non-land holding jurisdiction to be getting monies from FORA, and that shows up in a couple different places, and it does seem to me to have in most situations it has to do with fulfilling the responsibilities to develop Fort Ord. So anyway, it seems to me that would go to the landholding jurisdictions. Also, a question is that in here in the document it says that the landholding jurisdictions have or will have incorporated the base plan policies into their general plans. I think in most cases that has not happened, so I think that's something that probably needs to be addressed, and I kind of made a little list of things that need to be addressed in the negotiated agreements between the jurisdictions, and I think that's one, to make sure that the jurisdictions make a commitment and have a timeline for when those will be included. Okay, that I've covered. All right, so those are my questions, and just a sort of an overall comment that I think I've heard from other people, and that I think we got from Senator Monning's opening remarks, is that this is a good time to have a discussion and really try to talk through some of these issues rather than trying to take action on this plan today. Oh, and the other thing has to do with the facilitator. I think from what we've seen so far, FORA has been working hard and making a lot of efforts to come up with something. But I think at this point, I think we should put the money forward for a facilitator. I think that will help move the agreements forward. But I think maybe that facilitator might be hired by LAFCO and supervised by LAFCO, so that we don't put FORA in this awkward position that seems to have been, well, I just think it's an awkward position. So those are my thoughts for the moment, and I look forward to, I think the issues that were raised by Ms. Garfield and Mr. Hoffa, I mean, I think everyone's been contributing to some elements for a really good conversation, and hopefully we can come up with some ideas for moving forward that will get us where we need to be by December. Thanks.
is next.
I think I am.
Ms. Adams and then Mr. Moore.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And I want to thank Mr. Hulamard and Ms. Damon for incorporating so many of the ideas that have come forward into the resolution and the documents brought forward today. I appreciate that very much. Want to comment about on item 4, the reserved right of modifications, a very minor thing, item 4.6.4. I don't really think that we need to have getting a consultant as part of the resolution. I think that should simply be a separate action that takes place, and agree that if we were able to get this done sooner rather than later, it would be better. I'm not sure whether it should be LAFCO, although I think that the thought being more of an outside group looking in is probably going to be for the better health of all of us. I want to give special thanks to Yuri Anderson on my staff, who did take the time over the weekend to go through and very clearly document a whole lot of questions that we have, concerns that we have about some of the language, some things being a bit superfluous, some of the things being questions and specific issues that we have. But what I'm thinking now, the primary issue that we're concerned about, of course, is what Alan Hoffa and I think Cynthia and others have said, that until Section 4, until we resolve Section 4, the projects in the CIP, what really are we going to be viewing as the continuing, as the CIP? Until that's resolved, I think we're going to have a difficult time approving any kind of a resolution to go forward. But what I think would probably be helpful for us as a county, since I know that our county council has not had the opportunity to look at it, I think I will take the comments that we have just found personally to county council and review them with her before we come back for a staff. I think it's probably going to save a lot of time. If she or he, whoever is the county council assigned, disagrees with us, then that's one thing. But it may streamline things because we have done just a lot of work on this. It might streamline things if we just work with county council first and then bring it back to the board. I don't think we have county council here today, though. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Mr. Moore.
So Marina Coast is exceedingly thankful that we have such a small part of this extraordinarily complex transition process. That being said, our board hasn't had an opportunity to review Section 1.9 of the resolution, so I can only give you my personal opinion, supported by that of our General Manager, Keith Vandermotten. And we like the wording in 1.9. It looks appropriate. We did provide a letter, which all of you have on the dais, which, in thinking about everything we've been doing with respect to transition planning, to a certain extent, this letter represents Marina Coast's overall transition away from our agreement with FORA and continue to provide service to the Ord community going forward. I suppose we could put together something more formal with a title saying it is the Marina Coast /FORA or the FORA/Marina Coast transition plan to cover these issues. It will be important for the 5 land use jurisdictions to ultimately complete service agreements with us, which are under in draft form at our staff, and we will be bringing those hopefully in a timely manner, probably, I'm told, sometime after the first of the year, to the 4 city councils and the County Board of Supervisors. And essentially, what you have in 1.9 and what's in this letter lays out that we would, going forward, provide water and wastewater service as we've been doing so. We would, in fact, acknowledge and enforce the water allocations that have been provided by FORA to those land use jurisdictions. Essentially, the service agreements say that under the base reuse plan, we're not going to provide any more water to you than your FORA allocation. That being said, if you need water beyond that, you can always talk to us about a new project. and always talk to us about how to fund new projects. But what we won't do is look over to some other land use jurisdiction and go, okay, Marina, you're not using 500 acre feet, we'll transfer it to Seaside. That's not what's going to happen. And those service agreements will in fact memorialize that once we get them from the 5 land use jurisdictions. So generally speaking, we're happy with this, and we're here to support your base reuse plan and provide whatever answers to questions you might have.
Okay. Ms. Garfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually do have a question directed for you, and if you're going to take things back. The various different places talk about you're going to keep the allocation as is. That's not going, you're not going to change that. What I don't see, may have missed it, is the system you would propose for sharing a deficit in the availability of water. If there is less water available than you have promised, how will you distribute the deficit in a fair and equitable manner? I mean, how do people take the hit?
So I'm glad you're smart enough to be paying attention to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the fact that Marina Coast is a groundwater sustainability agency with responsibilities. If we find that we can't get enough groundwater, and for whatever reason we can't find other sources of water to fulfill this need, so in the extreme and we hope unlikely case that there have to be cutbacks, then they do need to be equitable, and I believe, I'll turn to Keith, I think that's being memorialized, equitable across the base reuse plan for the Ord community, so everybody would share the pain.
I just wanted to be sure that we weren't in a situation where first come, first served, and if you're a late bloomer, you end up with a dry tap. And you've assured me on that, but that's one of the challenges here is with unequal pacing, it's really hard that it's all going to come out even in the end. And I bet it won't, but to the extent that we can anticipate sharing things like that, I'd appreciate seeing that in some writing that you're doing.
Well, I believe he has that in the service agreements.
Okay, thank you.
Any other, yes, Mr. Matarazzo.
In an effort to simplify, as Director Parker recommended, I'm wondering why the transition plan can't just say, number one, all land use jurisdictions shall adopt base reuse policies that haven't been adopted yet. And number two, all land use jurisdictions shall incorporate into their CIPs those projects which have not yet been incorporated under the FORA plan, and reduce a lot of other language assigning costs. I've said this before, I'll say it again, I think CIPs are meant to be flexible. Everybody working in a city knows that. For 10 years, you might want to dedicate money to police that you can't afford public works to go into. So that would be my recommendation.
Okay. So we've got all the questions out there. I'm going to give Senator Monning an opportunity to answer the questions that were posed for him.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I really appreciate the level of engagement and specific points of concern and questions that distinguish this recent round of comments. I think the question that I recorded that was directed to me by Council Member Haffa asked specifically about could there be legislation that address some of the future issues short of an extension of FORA's authority. The short answer to that is yes. But to be clear, I'm not committing today to any legislation, but I remain fully open to any and all suggestions and options. The executive officer referred, or Attorney Damon, our earlier conversation with LAFCO today also explored, are there areas where legislation could answer some of the questions? And I think Mr. Matarazzo's suggestion, picking up on Supervisor Parker's question about simplifying, you cited some of those forward motion questions. Do you need legislation to do that? Could the parties agree to that and make that part of a transition plan language that LAFCO would then oversee the implementation of? So without making any specific commitments, I think some of the areas that we would be interested in looking at is base reuse plan, master resolution, CFD, but taking to heart the concerns raised by Councilmember Morton. We don't want to limit a jurisdiction's ability to fulfill commitments under base reuse plan or master resolution. But those are the things we should be looking at. And what I encourage or invite as homework is for the individual jurisdictions or working with FORA authority to provide us with some of those ideas. Don't just say we want an extension, say what it is you're trying to achieve. And there could be a legislative path that would address some issues without necessarily approving a full-blown extension of FORA authority. So I appreciate the question. Apologize if there's ambiguity in my response, but that is intentional. I want you all to do the work and bring me the best ideas possible, and I will work with you. Thank you. While I've got the floor, several of you raised the question of the facilitator and whether the facilitator might be better brought on by LAFCO. And again, at the risk of engaging in your business and your decisions, I fully support the idea of getting a facilitator engaged, and not just somebody who knows how to run a meeting, but somebody presumably or organization with subject matter expertise, legal expertise, etc. I think time is of the essence to get that person or group of people working with FORA and with LAFCO. And maybe in the interest of time, if the board today approves moving forward with the facilitator, part of the language is to work with the FORA board and LAFCO, draw LAFCO in as a partner in the facilitator, because I don't think there's a conflict of interest in the FORA board retaining a facilitator if the mission is articulated, which is articulated in legislation. We know what the requirement is. I do think it might be helpful to explicitly draw LAFCO into that facilitation process so that we're not going down separate roads, but that we have LAFCO engagement with the facilitator along with FORA board participation. Again, that's just a thought. You all will decide how you want to move forward on that element. But I know that to retain a facilitator, there's requests for proposals, etc. There's necessarily some time. Would have been nice to have someone on board earlier, but we are where we are, and I think moving forward, getting that outside, independent, third party who can roll up their sleeves with the parties here at FORA and potentially with LAFCO representation could be helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Now, Ms. Damon, you had a slew of questions asked for you. Are you prepared to answer some of those?
Is it time for me to faint? I will try to do my best.
Yeah, and if you can't answer them, we'll just carry them over to the next session.
All right. So, in general, I heard lots of questions about the CEQA issue. And I think the best way for me to approach the CEQA issue is to say that early on in the process, we budgeted about $200,000 for a potential environmental impact report. That's the cost of what an EIR would be. And the timeline for completing an EIR is about a year to a year and a half. So, and even though you do an EIR, that does not insulate this board or the subsequent jurisdictions from litigation. So very likely, even if we did an EIR, we would most likely be sued, and we would be a year plus $200,000 down the pike. That's not to say that an EIR is the only additional environmental review document FORA could look at. there are other documents that most likely might still get challenged, like an addendum to the base reuse plan EIR. That would be substantially less time and money. It's also not a public, it becomes public when it happens. There's a subsequent EIR, and then you have your full-blown EIR. So you have lots of different levels. We actually anticipated all of those as going forward. We ran this particular finding in your transition plan resolution by our CEQA consultants, and they were comfortable with this particular finding as it's currently drafted. But that being said, we can go back. A addendum to the EIR is about 90 to 120 days and about $75,000 to $100,000. So you're still looking at a pretty good chunk of money, and anywhere from 90 days to a year plus in terms of your timeline. That's the best I can give you in terms of CEQA, an answer on how to address the CEQA issue that have been raised, which I think at this point are very speculative. I'm going to jump around a little bit because there was an issue about the funding to finish the CFD, to finish the capital improvement program, actually. And I just want to decouple to a certain extent the requirement to raise funds from the requirement to implement a project. And by including FORA's projects in your capital improvement programs, you actually allow a process that allows more time. It might take you longer to raise the funding, but you have a plan, which is the CEQA mitigation requirement. You have to have a plan to implement the projects. So incorporation into the capital improvement programs of the jurisdictions, the underlying land use jurisdictions, I think is a very important point, and we don't know, and nor do the Land Watch folks know which of those projects the jurisdictions will incorporate or not at this point in time. Most of them are already there, and so I know at least 90% of them are there, and we have some time to finish those and to negotiate and facilitate the implementing agreements. But to the extent that all of the projects are in an implementing agreement and addressed, your CEQA issues start to go away because you are doing exactly the same plan that FORA is doing. It just might take you a different amount of time to implement it, and those are the financing issues. So if you lose your $72 million, and I'm going to say lose in quotes, that's because it's already entitled development, and it's hard to impose new fees on already entitled development. You have to have a replacement mechanism. Now, the City of Marina is right Johnny on the spot. They heard me 2 years ago when I said this. That this was an issue on already entitled development. They went right out and started to try to negotiate agreements with their developers, and they have at least one agreement with one of their developers, and I know they're in the process of negotiating the actual writings with their other developers. We haven't seen those yet, but we know they're in process. I still think there's an issue, though, that needs to be addressed in terms of making sure there is consensus, and a fundamental question to this board is consensus on finishing all the projects in the capital improvement program. So there was a question that was asked about what we have to finish or what we don't. And here's the bottom line. The bottom line, and I think Authority Council will back me up on this, is that all of the projects in FORA's capital improvement program were structured as base-wide mitigations. So our capital improvement program deals with all base-wide mitigations and base-wide costs at this point in time. So if you want to change what is left, you would need to change the capital improvement program to address the mitigations. FORA also adopted an override when it adopted the base reuse plan, and what is left is what is in the capital improvement program. So, and that's a finding in this resolution. And there's a reason for that, because if this is challenged after the fact, this board's legislative intent to finish the program that was started and to finish the mitigations is set forward as a regional statement in the transition plan resolution. Address those two questions. Litigation not settled by 2020. This goes back to Ms. Garfield's question. I'm not quite sure exactly how we address that. I know we have an escrow fund now set up that is managed by 5 folks, 1 from each underlying jurisdiction. We can certainly add back language, because I think I had some language in the previous version that tried to get at this. Although I will say that there was some discussion during the attorney's review of this, and so we changed the language, we took it out, but we certainly could put that language back in. I do think that it makes a certain amount of sense to manage ongoing litigation, trying to address the subsequent litigation by the insurance policies. That's what we were kind of thinking, is that having gap coverage is the way you start to do that, and the gap coverage is managed by either LAFCO or some other entity. And I'm looking over there to Authority Council, who assisted on coming up with that language. Let's see here. We talked about that. Ms. Morton asked a whole bunch of different questions. And one of the assertions, I think, that she made was that 67679D precludes a jurisdiction from adopting their own land-based financing. And that is unless FORA approves it. And currently, every jurisdiction here that has an implementation agreement could adopt their own land-based financing with FORA board approval. And it would surprise me if this FORA board would say no to an underlying jurisdiction that said we're adopting a CFD to replace the FORA CFD. But that being said, it's not precluded by just the simple language, but it does have FORA board approval as it's currently legislatively drafted. Let's see. You also raised an issue on section 2.1.6, source of funds, and I thought that our resolution actually tried to address the return to the source of the funds that paid in. But if it doesn't, we can certainly fix that, because I think that makes a lot of sense from a legal standpoint, so there's not a windfall issue. And related to that is the return, I think it's a policy issue, the return of funds for administrative liabilities to the underlying, all the member jurisdictions, versus rolling extra funds into reducing capital improvement program costs. That makes sense under my hat, but that I think is a policy decision as to how you want the transition plan to address administrative liabilities versus underlying real property liabilities. And again, that was how I had structured it originally, and it's been modified a little bit with this most recent version of the revision to the transition plan resolution. So that's certainly something we could incorporate in this resolution. HCP. Raised an issue about the HCP and should we put more into the HCP from the capital improvement program. I don't know that that's above my pay grade. I think that's a policy decision that this board will need to make as it moves forward through the base-wide HCP process. And what this transition plan resolution does do is it allows your board to make modifications based on the evolution and the refining of facts. So as we get more facts about the HCP and whether or not that's going to be the base-wide program or not, this plan as it's currently drafted can be refined to reflect that. ESCA, you raised an issue on CalPERS and the environmental services cleanup policy, and how do we address the CalPERS issue if we hire FORA staff to finish the ESCA contract. The ESCA contract actually is a reimbursement contract. We would anticipate that the CalPERS liability would go to whoever is the successor, and they would be reimbursed because the way the contract is set up, there is a certain amount of retirement funding that is built in with the reimbursement contract to cover the staff time on the ESCA contract. So the CalPERS, we incorporated it into the reimbursement amount. Role of county staff, jumping to Supervisor Parker. And if I've missed anybody's big picture issue, I apologize in advance. I'm just trying to go through these as quickly as possible. County staff has not seen this any more than anybody else. We released this revised version on Friday at 2:30, and we sent it out to everybody so that we have done, including the county attorneys who were working with FORA on those issues. So they have that, but the staff has not seen this particular version. And we acknowledge that there are some places where the county is collecting and distributing funds, like the county assessor's office, to collect the property tax revenues. That's what the county currently does, is collects the property tax revenues. And so there is a direction to keep collecting those and put them basically in a managed FORA account for payment of any obligations afterwards. So, and I'm sure there might be some other things that you're referring to there, but I'd want to see that list. It would be helpful for me. Have we looked at submitting a more simplified transition plan resolution to LAFCO? We have talked to LAFCO very briefly. The initial comment was they liked this resolution much better than the last resolution. I can tell you that. I think any plan that deals only with ESCA or only with one part of the plan and doesn't address all prongs of the assets, liabilities, obligations, does not comply with the legislative charge that we need to deal with a complete plan. So, yeah, it would be hard to do any plan that everybody would be in agreement to. I think that would give LAFCO the direction that they are looking at to try to move forward through the process. But that being said, we certainly can circle back with LAFCO staff and see if they are, if there's something that addresses all the prongs in the legislation that might be different from this resolution. I mean, we've tried to make this resolution very flexible, very complete, very holistic, and encouraging regional collaboration and implementation. And acknowledging that even if we did everything everybody would like us to do, we might still end up in litigation. So that's the approach that we've tried to follow. With respect to the administrative liability comment and the use of property tax revenues to address certain types of FORA debt, I would note that if the county is relying on the property tax revenues, they might consider looking at the Health and Safety Code section 33492.71, which is very explicit. It is a mechanism that is allowed to keep property taxes coming to pay for FORA debts. CalPERS, administrative liabilities, clearly FORA debt, and that's what we've heard loud and clear from all the jurisdictions. We don't want our general plan. These are your debts. We're not going to participate. You don't have to you can't make us participate in the payment of that. So CalPERS is a contract, it's a liability, and we believe those are eligible funds to pay any gap liability that's there, even though FORA has planned as much as it can plan, and it's set it aside. It's been very responsible, probably more so than many of our underlying jurisdictions in terms of terminated agency liability. So, you know, we all have our issues, but FORA has tried to be proactive in that approach. What if there's a judgment? I'm not sure I translated that question quite right, but I think this is related to how do you manage litigation post-2020? And right now we have insurance built into this plan, and we certainly could add back a management panel or something of the underlying. Most likely any litigation is going to be related to the underlying land use projects or things like that. I guess there could be some transition plan implementing challenges or LAFCO's enforcement, in which case, again, we are looking for that insurance policy, but in the absence of that, maybe there's a debt obligation. We might be able to encumber property tax revenues to cover those kinds of things if it's an actual debt of FORA, or set aside more, budget more funding for that. Right now we have what LAFCO's estimated 1 year of budget in there at $300,000. And we heard today that it might be more than that. So could definitely bring that back in the next budgeting cycle.
While Sheri's looking, there were 3 comments I noted in here that talked about litigation. One had to do with responding to letters we received that were somewhat challenging, not necessarily threatening litigation, but at least listing that as a possibility. Also, there was a comment about working with county council, and there was a question about going back to the jurisdictions after the fact. I think Sheri's already addressed the question about insurance to try to cover that issue about general funds or jurisdictions picking it up if it had to come back. So the insurance would be the way to cover that. I think with respect to responding to the letter, I think the board always has a choice about this. I believe council will always suggest that you make sure that you respond in the record. So we're likely to do that when this comes forward for a vote. I'm not sure when that'll happen. I heard at least 4 people. I thought 5 actually talk about not voting today on that particular questionable item. So therefore, I think it would have to be in the next item. We would address it that way. Unless council has a different approach, I think we would respond appropriately. Sorry.
Can I ask a follow-up question on the insurance issue? So my question is, what type of liability insurance is available to cover CEQA violations or an alleged CEQA violation? Because if it was available, A, would it apply to past acts that were being sued on actions that happened in 2017? I don't think it would, number one. Number two, if that's not resolved by 2020. And number two, if such an insurance policy was available, why don't we have it currently? As opposed to that we're paying for Mr. Giffen's firm, paying for defense, paying out liability. So what type of insurance policies are you talking about beyond a tail policy for your workers' comp, a tail policy perhaps for negligence? I'm not sure what type of insurance you're talking about that's now available to us when we transition.
So this was an issue that was raised actually by Marina's lawyers, that we seek that kind of a policy. So we included that language in the transition plan so that we will go look for that policy. I have to tell you, I am a little bit in your line of thinking that it might be very difficult, if not impossible, to obtain pure CEQA coverage or transition plan coverage that would handle CEQA litigation. But that being said, this plan says, go see if you can get it, and if you can, bring it back to us and let us know what it is, how much it costs. Is it going to cost more than the $300,000 that we've got set aside? I mean, there's a whole bunch of related issues, but again, this was an attempt to be responsive to an issue that the City of Marina's lawyers actually raised with us. So I think there's one other question that was asked about the most reasonable time to bring this back if we're not going to vote today. I think we have a fairly short window in my thinking. We have legislation that says majority vote on the one hand, so one vote to do the transition plan. And if that were the case, we would be looking for that, I think, at the next regular meeting on November 9th, which would allow a 2-week vetting period. If it's 2 votes, however, because everything else at FORA has been on 2-vote rule, we would anticipate still a first vote then probably on November 9th, and either a second vote in November at a special meeting or at a regular meeting in December. That would be staff's anticipation, but of course the board has is the board and can set whatever the board needs to set in terms of timeline. But that is kind of staff's thinking off the, trying to address the question, given the
Ms. Garfield.
December 2018 timeline.
Ms. Garfield.
Thank you, Chair. So following up on your question about the sequencing of events, we still need to have something that we then take to our various councils, that we're all taking the same thing to them to get their direction before we come back for a first or only vote. So that seems like we're running out of time. How?
Let me take a stab at that. I think if we come back on November 9th and look at what the reassembled offering is, take a good look at that. We can take a preliminary vote as to this is what it's going to look like, and then we can take it back to our councils for vetting, and then have a second vote.
Okay, thank you. I think that works. We'll have something to work on.
At least that gives us something to work with.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we could be in this circular thing for a long time.
Circling the drain, as a matter of fact.
Chair, and to respond to your other question about, your question was how do we all get the same item? But you had another question about how do you share thoughts on the transition plan?
Right.
And I wanted to go back to that because I think, again, the earlier we get these questions, we can then assemble them and get them to the whole board, along with the questions and the points being included in the revisions. Now, it's clear there's going to be some have already taken very strong positions and taken it to their councils and taken an action that may be contrary to what we present. So it may be impossible to get something that everybody has the same item. But to the extent that we can respond to what's been requested and items that have been given to us, we can get those back out to board members without it violating the Brown Act. I think the conversation between board members is not a good idea at all. I would discourage that. But if you can get the questions to us at staff so that we can share the question and respond to everyone, I think that's an appropriate, we can't interact, but we can get that response out.
Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up question just on that?
Let her finish.
Oh,
please.
sorry. I want to know where we send them, because the planning versus
Good
the full
question.
board.
Yeah, let's finish that question because it's germane to what we were just talking about.
May I?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So Sheri has asked us to write to planning@fora.org. City of Marina has written to FORA board so that it makes sure that the comments or questions are circulated among all voting and all other members and the public. So I think that to the point is that I would like to hear from PG and would request that you send it to the board so it gets distributed to the mass mailing, and ask Marina to do that also, as opposed to internal at the planning.org.
Okay. But I understand the
Just
difference between the two.
to reiterate the alert that I've made at this board several times, just don't hit reply all or respond and interact.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So just to put the dot on that one, we want to do this as soon as possible, right? Okay. Okay. So just a tiny correction on 4.2. You're talking about members, and this is talking about members versus land use jurisdiction members, two different categories. In 4.2, you're talking about each member jurisdiction enter a transition plan. Can we differentiate between members and land use jurisdiction or land receiving members?
You know, we can do that. I guess my suggestion would be if we're trying to get council's comments, those kinds of corrections are relatively simple corrections, but if I'm sitting trying to make that adjustment, then you're not going to have anything to take to your council until
But
November 9th.
my question is that are you suggesting that every member have a transition, or are you suggesting only that land use jurisdictions have one? So I think it's substantive rather than a grammar issue.
Yeah, I think originally it was supposed to be everybody, because I think the original, and there were some changes in the earlier paragraphs that changed how the monies went back to the member agencies, which the thought was that any agency that was going to get returned funds from FORA would have to have an implementing agreement. That was the original thinking there, and that has changed in the transition plan resolution, so that the monies actually are going into a capital improvement program, for example, and all the administrative liabilities are addressed. So realistically, the only entities left to do a transition plan implementing agreement is going to be the underlying land use jurisdictions.
Okay, and that clarifies 4.2. But this is my other point, is I think something we can agree to is I don't think any non-land use jurisdiction member should get any money back for anything. Because the funding comes from land. It doesn't come from our massive 14.5 per year. And so if maybe we just agree, then we'll just not do that.
That would be great if the board had consensus on that. That would be a thumbs up for me.
Right
I can fix that in the resolution pretty easily.
Okay, I'd like to make a motion that we agree that no non-land use jurisdiction gets any funds back from anything left over from anything. Oh, it's not agendized.
Well, it's
It's a really
well,
good.
it's part of the transition plan, though.
I thought we could use something like that. Okay, and then one last little question.
Well, wait a minute.
Okay.
Let's go back to what you were saying. It's
Yeah.
part of the transition plan, so we could take a consensus on that, so, to direct staff in regards to that. Is there anyone opposed to that idea?
I'm not opposed, but I would like to have the flip side, that we wouldn't have any bills sent to the non-land use jurisdiction.
Okay, so I think that's settled. Mr. Edlin?
Since Cynthia's already started the low-hanging fruit that we all agree on, we have 6 staff recommendations. 3 of them, I think, are motherhood and apple pie. That's number 3, directing staff to take appropriate action to comply with state law requiring a transition plan submittal. We've got the state senator here. I think he would be happy about that. The next one, authorize the executive officer to support a LAFCO indemnification agreement. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And the other one, authorize the executive officer to retain facilitator services not to exceed $100,000. We've been talking about that. I think we all agree on that. So if we get these 3 out of the way, then we can discuss the remaining 3. Make a motion that we move staff recommendations for recommendations 3, 4, and 5.
I'll second that.
Okay, the motion is second. On the second.
If I could just ask the maker of the motion, one of the things we talked about was including LAFCO as working with the facilitator and FORA. Is that all right?
I'd just like to make on that issue about LAFCO doesn't meet until December 3rd. So if we're going to, I hope we're not going to wait for LAFCO. We're going to go ahead and move on and then call them in. Okay, good.
Yes, I just have a concern about number 3, where it indicates direct staff to take appropriate action to comply with state law requiring transition plan submittal parents based on the approved resolution. So I don't think, so, yeah.
Does your second still sit there?
I think we should remove that.
Just do.
So 4 and 5, I would even go so far as 4, 5, and 6.
I don't know.
Okay, how about 4 and 5?
Yeah,
Medium hanging
and
fruit.
Okay,
staff,
there's a motion on 3, 4, and 5 with the removal of based on approved resolution in item 3 and the inclusion of LAFCO in number 5. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and there's a second.
They shouldn't do LAFCO yet. They shouldn't do LAFCO until we
Okay, I think the seconder was okay with that. Okay, so are there any other comments on this? Senator Monti.
I encouraged the inclusion of LAFCO. I don't know if the board can bind LAFCO, so maybe the language is with an open invitation and strong encouragement for LAFCO participation with the facilitator, then we're not trying to exercise jurisdiction over LAFCO, but we're putting in strongly termed language, strong encouragement, open invitation, and recommendation that they participate with the facilitator in that process.
Right, okay, so that's included. Ms. Morton?
So I have a question as to the process of the selection of a facilitator, and if it's an RFP, to the scope of what's written in that RFP, what we're asking for. And I think Alan's nodding his head, but I think a lot of the jurisdictions want to at least have some say in who are we working with, and not just FORA staff deciding that.
Subcommittee.
It has to be a subcommittee, something, but I'm asking, what's that process?
Am I supposed to answer that?
Well, I don't think we developed it.
I'm going to make a suggestion.
What's the plan?
Okay, if I can make a suggestion, if we form an ad hoc subcommittee of the transition task force is too hard to schedule. I'm thinking of 3 people, 2 people, couple FORA staff. Gail, you've got an interest in this,
We
and
have,
maybe
we
one
have
of,
the executive committee meeting next Wednesday.
can you figure out a subcommittee that includes people to get it moving forward? Because
Yeah.
that's real important. Thank you.
You can handle it there. Yes, sir.
I'm just thinking, I understand people's concerns, but we may be getting in the weeds here. It says clearly authorize the executive officer to do it. So, I mean, with Mr. Hullamar's experience background, he's here hearing what we all have to say. He's going to implement the will of the board, and I think all of us have made our intentions clear to start appointing subcommittees and have them make recommendations to the executive. I mean, that just, we're getting in the weeds right now. And if we're going to do that, we have so little time left to go. Just my recommendation.
Mr. Moore?
Just a quick question. I just want clarity on the motion. It is on number 4 and number 5 on the agenda?
Yes.
Or was it 3, 4, and 5 with certain words removed from 3?
Right.
4 and 5.
3, 4, and 5. 3, 4, and 5.
Well, that's what I'm trying to, I see there's
The
some
motion was
confusion.
for 3, 4, and 5 with the parentheses based on approved resolution deleted and the addition of the language that Senator Monning in regards to LAFCO.
And staff would request that you add to number 4 upon
Yes.
approval of a
number 4.
resolution to submit.
Excuse me, say that again?
It should be number 4. I'm not going to execute an indemnification agreement until I have a document to submit. So upon approval of a transition plan.
Without a transition plan, if you need the transition plan to sign an indemnification agreement, which I agree with you, and number 2, we don't have a transition plan that's approved, so what is staff doing other than what we've been doing for 3 years, which is trying to come up with a transition plan consistent with state law? So what is the purpose of adopting anything besides, at this point, number 5, with the addition of inviting LAFCO to cooperate as appropriate?
So if I could speak to that, I think what 3 would do is make it very clear that the board's intent is that by December 2018, we have a plan. One way or another, we're going to have a plan by December 2018. That's essentially what that does. I don't know, I guess I take your point about number 4, but again, it's making it clear that this is our intent, is that we will indemnify LAFCO.
And whether or not we have it today, tomorrow, or next week, we still have to have that indemnification agreement, or LAFCO's not going to accept it. Okay, is there any other? Yes, ma'am.
Just in the interest of time and the fact that we are under the gun time-wise, adding number 6 is just it would simply be to me a direction to all of us that we do have a timeline, and this is an important timeline to adhere to. That would be adding number 6 as well.
Well, and just to clean up number 6 a little bit, it all seems like it would be fine if we have the sentence end on the progress of negotiations. So there's no reference to a transition plan, which we don't have yet.
Cleaner.
If people want to include it, but I don't know if the maker of the motion wants to.
Is the maker of the motion willing to include number 6 with the change? Okay, is the second or?
So I just want to make sure I understand. So the Supervisor Parker, you're suggesting we include 6, but without the last bit and any additional information to refine the transition plan, because we don't have that yet. Okay, yeah, I'm okay
It's
with
redundant. It's the
Okay.
same thing as progress on negotiations.
Right. Okay, so, call into question. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very, very much. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for coming today. When we last met, I left you with the charge of submitting questions and suggestions to make this document better. And I'm glad that everybody took that to heart and did that and actually came in and engaged and did some good work here. I want to thank Senator, where'd he go? He left.
He left?
He got smart. Oh, Ms. Garfield and then you.
Are we done?
I want to
Not yet.
try something.
I want to try something else. I want to go back to CEQA. And item number 2 reminded me of, this is a call to find that we are in fact exempt. And I understand the process was carefully vetted, but I got to say, I would be more comfortable with a written opinion from a CEQA consultant as to the findings that it is exempt.
Could I add, I would be interested in hearing more about what Supervisor Phillips mentioned about seeking declaratory relief. I don't know what that is involved in that, how long that takes, but I'd like to know more about that.
Thank you.
Declaratory relief is a court process that is invoked when two parties have a dispute that is unresolvable and an actual controversy exists. And if you file the complaint for declaratory relief now in Monterey County Superior Court, it would be heard by a judge within probably 18 months to 2 years. So sometimes there's a little bit of a fast track. You can try to push it, but it's not an automatic response. But you can do that when two parties have differing views and there's a legal issue at stake. You ask the court for their declaration of how things come out and what the parties' rights are. And as to the CEQA issue, we have been engaged with our consultant on what we've been able to come up with so far, and he has not had the opportunity to review the latest Land Watch letter, but did review the prior letter, and we're continuing to get response from him. We can come up with a written response. I think it's appropriate to have a good record that we do address the questions that have been raised, which are comprehensive and complex and meaningful. So we can he's just had knee replacement surgery. So, he'll be relaxing and dealing with this. So I'll be in contact with him in the next day, and it would be my intention to get a written response.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Parker, then Ms. Morton, and then Judge Phillips.
So actually, I have something that's different than the CEQA issue, so I don't know if you all were going to continue on that issue. Maybe we want to complete that conversation.
That resolves it for me.
Okay.
Well,
we used to be the most current in the county, and I realize we're not any, or in the state, but I realize we're not anymore. But I think on a matter of this magnitude, you could get it expedited, even if you had to bring in an out-of-county judge, which might be well anyway, and bring in a judge specially to hear it. So I think you could get something quicker than 18 months, especially something that has this magnitude about it.
Something to explore. Yes, sir.
So that was to judge, getting a judge or an outside judge. That's not the point. But the point is, should we file the declaratory relief, ask the court for expedited hearing on it, so that if in fact it is an issue, that it gets addressed as quickly as possible. So be proactive in doing that, number one. Number two, as members sitting here voting, we need to be able to rely on something. You ask us to make a finding that this is exempt from any kind of CEQA review. No, I want the transition plan, if I'm going to support it, to state that in reliance on a legal representation from somebody, because I want his malpractice insurance on the line, not my revenues if we are sued and incorrect, and I want a defense paid for by somebody besides your tax increment or my tax increment. So asking us to make that finding when we do not have any expertise in this issue as directors, I'm very uncomfortable with, and I would be surprised that anybody sitting here has the level of expertise in CEQA to make that decision. File the declaratory relief.
I think it's important, as Senator Monty said, to frame the issues and to offer solutions. And I don't think that issue is exempt. I think that the board still has to work together with the guidance from the lawyers to frame the issues. The plan has been out for not that long. We've gotten 80 pages of objections, and so we're sorting through those. It would be, again, my intention to frame the issues, let the board understand them, and then you can vote.
Thank you. As I understand it, we need to have some specific thing that the court is ruling on, so you'd have to ask, I guess, if we submitted this transition plan, would it be subject to CEQA? Or, you have to figure out what your specific thing is you're asking.
And I can tell you that the consultant up to this point has been satisfied that
we don't.
It's exempt from CEQA.
Mm-hmm.
So
okay.
That's how we get here before
Got it.
Before we get letters from, before we changed a lot, and now we are where we are,
right.
And we're going to keep working.
Right. So what I wanted to try was, I'd like to make a motion that we direct staff to draft a more bare bones transition plan that lays out the issues, the process to address them, and the timeline. And that we have, and Cynthia, that we have an ad hoc committee of people who are interested in that option, work with staff, so we have that option to come to us on November 9th when we are going to be asked to look at another iteration of something that has built-in controversies that I think it's going to be really difficult for our jurisdictions to adopt and support. So I don't know if anyone else is interested in that idea, but I put it out there.
So I'll second that. Let's have a discussion. May I, Mr. Chair? So in the FORA transition presentation, the draft transition plan study session from June 8, 2017, there were two slides, one about extending FORA, and secondly, a multiple agency function transfer that has regional transportation going to TAMC, off-site, on-site roads to the jurisdictions, water augmentation, water rights, wastewater, MCWD, habitat conservation plan to an HCP, Army, ESCA to the county, building removal goes to the jurisdictions, base reuse plan consistency goes to the jurisdictions and fully fund PERS by 2020. So this was the alternative to the extension of FORA in the June 2018 FORA transition plan study session. This is what I would be interested in having this ad hoc committee address, is these seem to be the obligations that need to be assigned, and let's look at this. MCWD is stepping up and taking a lead in this. I think TAMC has also spoken out in their willingness to take on regional transportation. As the city of Marina, I am addressing with my city council, taking on what are our roads and our obligations. That's a transition plan that has not been brought to us.
So, Mr. Chair,
Yes.
my concern is this seems like we're kind of going backwards because we had a plan that was very schematic, sort of in nature. And I think there were a number of directors and jurisdictions and LAFCO as well, who said, we need more specifics, we need more details. So even though I don't agree with everything in this current rendition, it seems like the staff were making an effort to give us a more detailed plan. So it seems like if we'd be going backwards if we sort of made it more generic could you explain?
I speak to that?
Yeah.
So my thought is that this plan that follows the outline of all the issues we've been discussing for months and years would basically say, so if you choose ESCA, for instance, it would be, that's an issue. The resolution to that issue would be that the county and the city of Seaside, who are the named possible successors, are in negotiations now that we have a facilitator. Soon we will. They are working on the agreement to take care of that obligation. So we don't have the details yet. It's not going to be spelled out in the plan. It's going to be in the voluntary agreements between the jurisdictions.
It's the framework.
Right. So, and then down the list, habitat. We have the way that we think we're working on habitat. We will know by such and such a time whether that is, whether plan A is happening or whether we move to plan B. So that would be just it's basically a framework, and that the detail would come when those agreements are negotiated. And those, and we could spell out, I think some of the things we need to have in the agreement are, we will adopt the base reuse plan policies. We will address replacement funding for habitat transportation, and if there's money needed for another jurisdiction, how are we going to share it? Affordable housing, prevailing wage, those things are going to be in those agreements. And once we have the agreements, then we have the detail, and then we also see what's missing, and what other issues need to be resolved. But the idea is to keep the actual plan that goes to LAFCO at this point to be something that we can agree on. And many of the details are pretty close to resolution, but that what we would put in there is, the issue is this, here's who's going to talk to whom about it, though we are going to have an update on those negotiations in March of 2019, and, whatever the thing is, you lay it out that way.
I sat on those transition task force meetings, and I recall that. And I do recall that several directors at that time said, that's not enough. We need more detail. We don't know what our cities are getting into. There's who's getting assigned what. So we've come a long way since then to this point now. And, we've put staff through a lot to get to this point. If we knew that we were just going to stop there, then we wouldn't be where we are today with all these different iterations and possible agreements and the language that we have. I think we're on a good path to getting there. I would suggest that Supervisor Parker and Ms. Morton, if they want to submit a detailed alternate for the next meeting, that would be probably a good idea. But I think staff has probably got more than enough work to do right now on what we've been working on. But that's just my take, Mr. Eland and Ms. Garfield.
We've been working on this for well over 2 years. Again, what Mayor Rubio said is true. We've gone back and forth from more inclusive to more general to more inclusive. What we have right now is a great plan. We're running out of time. We've got to December, at the end of December, to get this thing done. We can't start from scratch again. I think the problem is not so much the format that we have. It's the fact that there are some winners, there are some losers in the base in this transition plan. There are. Some folks want to go on their own, others want a collective approach, and we're probably never going to breach that divide. There are some incentives and disincentives in the plan we have right now, and I believe some jurisdictions don't like the disincentives. I think the plan, what we have right now, is good. It can be modified to some extent, yes, but it's something we can actually make work and finish by the end of this year. We start from scratch again, we're still going to have those disagreements as far as policy and everything else. So I just see this as a distraction.
Ms. Garfield.
No, I think we can have it both ways. I think that there's some overviews we can do that may be an overlay to this that simplifies it and comes up with the surfaces the structure, and then details are attached. So I don't think it's starting over again, and I happen to have a streamlined plan right here that it builds actually from this plan. You extract a simplification overview, and I think it explains it very well. So I think we can have it both ways, not go backwards, get agreement on as many details as possible, but still have an agreement on the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish that lets us move forward. So I'm optimistic.
Ms. Weimer.
A couple of things came out of the transition plan that we have in front of us, and one is paragraph LJ, last sentence, and it just says that the transition agreement shall be negotiated and developed for the mutual benefit of all recipients. And as a non-jurisdiction representative, that means the broader community to me. And I think that I bold printed it, and that is really an important part of this agreement to me. Another part that I think is what we're talking about of who's going to agree with what and what kinds of responsibilities our jurisdictions going to take going forward. That's on page 15, 2.1.10, and part of it, I'll just read the last few sentences, is that well, this has to do with assets, but the transition plan implementing agreement, and that's what we're talking about. That's what is being talked about, that the plans between the jurisdictions are going to be worked out, and I don't think we need to go to any bare bones on that, because they're going to make up their own, they're going to have, each jurisdiction has their concerns, and they're going to be addressing them in the plan as it's set out here with the transition plan implementing agreements. And so I don't think we need to take our staff's time to go to the bare bones. Maybe we can, if the people here around the table have an outline that they want to submit and take that time and that responsibility, that's fine with, that would be my recommendation. But my recommendation is that we continue working on the document that we have today. It's been simplified. I think it's been clarified. I think it's a step in the right direction to do again what is mutually beneficial for the greater community, and that's to me key.
Okay, so we have a motion on the floor to appoint a ad hoc committee to come up with, work with staff on a simplified version. I would say though that we don't know if LAFCO will even consider a simplified version.
And to the extent, let me just insert a word of caution, that to the extent that we change or modify or limit the existing plan, it could trigger the need for a sequel analysis. And so we have to be careful about that.
Okay.
That could be a costly and lengthy EIR process in itself.
Okay, so on the motion, let's have a roll call vote.
Ad hoc committee.
Director Parker?
Yes.
Director Phillips?
No.
Director Adams?
No.
Director Edelin?
No.
Director O'Connell?
Yes.
Director Morton?
Yes.
Director Hoffa? No. Director Rubio?
No.
Director Alexander? No. Director Carbone?
No.
Director Garfield?
Yeah. Yes.
And Director Reimers?
No.
Okay, so the motion fails. But if you have an idea for a simplified plan, just submit to staff. And you might submit them earlier than later so that we all get a look at them.
Sir?
To the, yeah,
Right,
to
so-
everybody.
So, as I had mentioned, I'm going to work with our county council to do that, and I'm just wondering if other jurisdictions have the same opportunity to do that, so they would at least know we're, moving in a legally sound direction.
Okay, so that takes care of the business items. The next item is public comment on matters not on the agenda. Is there any public comment at this time? Okay, items for members. All right, then we stand adjourned till November 9th. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for good work.